A lot of the time, like Drake and I, we think about how Paul's letter makes use of another literature, like the scriptures, for example. But you seem to be thinking about Paul's letter as literature, as a piece of literature in itself. How is it used as a piece of literature? How is it received as a piece of literature?
I'm not so sure if I considered a piece of literature. I considered, of course, it is a letter, but I consider it as a lesson, as an admonition, as a communication. And of course, it's written communication, but in the same time, it's part of the communication between Paul and his disciples.
Undoubtedly, it's a piece of communication, but you're looking at how it works internally as a piece of literature. And also, do you think that Paul intended it to be referred to again and again? Do you think he intended the Corinthian audience to refer to this letter again and again? That's what happened. Did he intend it?
Interesting question, but I think that was part of writing letters. Lindsay agrees.
I would agree in this period. It's the function of letters, usually occasions, political, and just presuming a lot about Paul and how he expects to be treated by how he expects to be treated as a leader and by the Corinthians and give them advice.
That was part of letter culture, epistolary culture. Yeah. But you're suggesting that it is not.
No, I'm not suggesting. I'm asking. I mean, it's been very important in the last 100 years of interpretation, perhaps even going back. People often mention Bauer, even before 100 years, saying we have to attend to the real context of this letter, the context which prompted Paul to write, the context which was an intrinsically communicative, discursive context of sometimes debate, sometimes discussion. So certainly we all accept now that these are real acts of communication, but there's something about the care with which you see him implanting this kaleo language, for example, through a section of the letter. And I think we can see it with other key terms as well. I mean, the fact that the word nous only appears in the call to be united in one mind, and then again at the end of chapter 2, but we have the mind of Christ. It's so conspicuous that this word appears at these two very important moments. So I think, but you're tracing the implanting of certain key words, these rhythmical embedding of certain keywords through the letter, that of course it's a real piece of communication, but he seems to be composing this very carefully to be reread and revisited a number of times, I think, not just one performance. Sorry.
Yeah.
I just want to continue adding on to that, because I pick up your thoughts too, Jonathan, that you're expecting this to be reread and reread. And I can't doubt that First Corinthians was reread, certainly from the section from First Clement that we just looked at. But I do wonder about, maybe going back to your question, did he expect it to be reread when he wrote it? Because then I'm left with a few lost letters.
Those lost letters, so especially when you go to 2 Corinthians, that's all speculation. Yeah. So of course you have different letters, and even then, I think that you can see that the letters are written to communities. It depends. There's a lot of things going on in the community, and sometimes they keep letters, and sometimes they're going to lose some of them. So I don't think that that's a very strong point against the point that Paul expects them to reread them, as is, for instance, said in 2 Thessalonians that these words are written for you as paraklesis, and the beginning of 2 Corinthians is also full of comfort and joy. Only comfort, no joy.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I think that this was to be reread. Maybe let's use another term, alliteration. Yeah. Could that be something that's a part of this? Yeah. But I am puzzled with the lost letter.
Listen. There's happening so much, and most of the literature is lost, of course.
Also, one thing, you have to ask yourself why the letters which were preserved, why were they preserved? If we assume that all early Christians would assume that all Pauline letters must be preserved because they must be important, then we will wonder why is the Corinthian letter.
But if you look to the textual evidence, then sometimes they are arranged in such a sequence, and then suddenly they are arranged in another sequence. So it slowly became a unity, and that indicates that it's slowly collected. And when you are collecting stamps, you always lose one.
Well, I would assume that the letters of Paul, which had been collected and were being copied into little Pauline codices by the early 2nd century, the ones that were collected reflects the priorities of the person that collected them.
Of course. Also.
And I would say they probably are the author of Ephesians, but that's a different story. I think whoever collected the Pauline corpus that we receive is also the author of the letter to the Ephesians. But anyway, somebody collected them. They were more interested in some than others, I guess. It's not necessarily the case that every letter that Paul sent was automatically cherished. Or maybe it was cherished, but then whoever collected them several decades later just made a selection.
Maybe it was a schism.
Oh, yeah.
Schism. So maybe the lost letter was relevant to the one and they went off to the void.
Can I ask?
What we don't know, huh?
Yeah.
We only assume.
Can I ask, Lindsay? When you nod, when you say a letter is to be sort of revisited by an audience, doesn't that depend on what kind of letter? Aren't there quite ordinary, mundane letters in the papyri which are really genuinely single moments of
There
disposable
are, but they
communication?
are extraordinary situations. So something bad happened. So something bad happened, and so somebody writes a private. That would be a private level letter, I would think. But it's not like, oh, how are you doing, Uncle Jeremy? You know, everything's fine here. Thank you.
There are such letters. It depends on the chance to find such letters. Because a letter would just say, "Oh, how is Uncle doing?" You normally throw away early because if you don't like the uncle. But we know them from Persian time. We have a lot of such scribbled notes. We have this, please look after the children and give them two breads tonight. And these were really letters. And we have also quite a few letters which obviously are only for one opportunity. For example, most of the Bar Kochba letters, we say, go tomorrow there. There's no need to reread them the day after tomorrow. But they were kept probably because they were letters from the boss. But what they speak about is only for one situation, and they're so good preserved, so you can really see there was really open once, closed again, stored away, and they never had been written. Sometimes we even have the feeling they have never been read, because the messenger would have already told them what is there.
Exactly.
And this is also by the style of the letters. For example, the Bart Koet letters often you have the address, and then it starts with she tikach, that you do. This means this is the shorting form of the command to the messenger. Tell him she, that you should do this. So probably sometimes we have the feeling they never have been opened, because short the messenger said, do this. They believed the messenger, so they had no need to look into the letter.
But there's another indication that these letters were meant to stay there, because in the letter Paul gives quite a few rules, and at the end, for instance, he says, do this and do that. And that's a kind of an appointment. And so you have to keep these rules. And therefore you have to keep the letter. Dus from the character of the letter, you can argue that it is for the archives.
Yeah, I mean, I always, when I read Galatians, we only have Galatians, and there's no indication in Galatians that another Galatian letter was lost. But when I read Galatians, I feel like I'm entering the middle of quite complex.
But that's of course the truth. But for them it was different. For them it was different. So if you compare, this is already old-fashioned, the letters of Paul with a telephone call, yeah, you only hear half of the letter, of course, but it was, of course, part of a communication, and the people who received the telephone call knew the themes, and therefore for us it's difficult to understand. We can quote Aristotle, who says that a letter is an halbiertes Zwiegespräch, only half of a dialogue. But in the meantime, people who know about the other side, they kept the letter and probably reread it several times.
Well, somebody must have either sent a messenger or written a letter, or both, telling Paul the details of Galatia, because I mean he's aware of the kind of arguments that his opponents seem to be making. He seems to be aware of the kind of passages in Genesis and that sort of in Isaiah that they're referring to. So he can respond. So I think there must have been some communication of some.
No, but the whole communication in the early church, in early Christianity, but also I think in late antiquity, was via messengers, and it was a very, very good system. If you can see how, for instance, Jerome orders books from France, and he pays for it. So the whole system of letter writing was such a high level of communication. It was, to a certain extent, the World Wide Web. But there, of course, for instance, in Augustine, all the messengers were deacons. Why? Because they were trustworthy. So there was a system for people bringing the letter. You didn't give to the postman because they were not there, and you did not trust them. And so you looked for somebody you can trust, and you gave him the letter.
I mean, again, with Galatians, he engages with the position of his audience, with the positions of the third party, whom he never directly addresses, but he engages with their positions. And then in chapters 5 and 6, he introduces this much more general teaching, it's quite general parenetic section of how people should behave, and that in particular gives that letter the feel of something Paul meant them to keep, Because why would you give general teaching that might be...
If you look to the rhetorical structure of collation, you can see that first he does all kind of... he put a narratio, then he gives the problem, and then the last part, it's just the more friendly tune. So it totally fits in the rhetorical structure. And so it's not at all weird that he does that. And the combination between letters, and there's a lot of discussion about whether Paul used rhetorics and if you can use all those rules, but in the meantime you can apply to a certain extent some rhetorical rules for the letters of Paul, and that's also an indication that it is that you have again. It's yes, it is written, but it was meant to be read and to be heard more than to be read, and so it's part of the rhetorical world of that time that Paul is writing letters.
And that lovely moment at the end of one of the Thessalonian letters, make sure you gather all the brethren and read it out to them, he says. Is it 2 Thessalonians? I can't remember.
I think it's...
Yeah.
I was wondering about, you repeated it again, the idea that this is a letter that was intended to be read out loud, so it's a letter that nonetheless stresses the need for orality. But it seems to me interesting that you're emphasising the use of language of Kaleo, but not stressing the fact that he's using a letter to do this. I mean, it's explicitly about communicating across distance through a written medium. And I was especially interested in the bit that you call on, the bit that you mentioned towards the end, when you have the contents of Paul's call, the call for unity against schisms. And you have parakaleo as, and now I call upon you, brothers and sisters. Yeah. And yes, I mean, that is absolutely another use of the word kaleo, but I mean, parakaleo does kind of stress, again, the kind of distance. It's like, I summon you, or I encourage you.
I would not translate parakaleo in that sense. I would really say, call it so bring it with you. Yeah, you can translate summon, but for instance, when you go to the beginning of 2 Corinthians, well, in 1 Corinthians, Paul uses kaleo. In 2 Corinthians, he uses parakaleo 10 times. Yeah, in the introduction, and there it's really more in the sense of comfort. So you can see that Paul, and according to me, that's also again intentionally. So in his first letter he used parakaleo in the beginning, and in the first letter he used kaleo, and in the second letter he uses parakaleo, but in the sense of comfort. And parakaleo you can also use parakaleo in the sense of sermon. So the logos paraklesos. So in Acts it is used as sermon. So it is
What do you mean? What do you mean by comfort? I suppose I'm just. It's a sort of classic philological argument. You just go around the houses all day, coming up with different translations for it. But I don't. It's not something that commonly means comfort.
The root of parakaleo is to call, and para is come with us. So it's to bring you into.
Sort of alongside.
Yes, but there are several. Of course, you never can be totally clear about the meaning of a word, but you can see that Paul uses parakaleo in the sense of giving comfort. In 2 Corinthians 12, and what I did with kaleo in 1 Corinthians 1, you can do with parakaleo in 2 Corinthians. So the repetition of parakaleo in 2 Corinthians is nearly boring because it's so often, and he is playing with the different meanings of parakaleo.
I'll have to look at it myself.
Is that an answer? No.
Well, I think basically it makes my question. It makes the point that I was trying to make not worth making, but I suppose
Of course, it's worth making.
Well, no, I mean in the sense it responds and says, this isn't the problem, but I'm not necessarily sure that I would have to look at 2 Corinthians to decide whether I'm convinced so. But I suppose there is paramuthia can mean paramuthia can mean comfort, or paramuthia, so like speaking next to one can mean comfort. So that's there you would have para meaning close to in that sense. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
I always take it to mean something like I appeal to you.
Yeah, appeal. Yeah. I call you. Yeah, appeal to you is also a possible. Yeah, but you have to try to look whether there are in English words we can keep the word call in it.
Yeah. I think this goes back to a point that Jim Aitken made here a few years ago. It goes back to a point that Jim Aitken made here a few years ago. He said we become profoundly influenced by our lexicons, and we might find that people thinking in a New Testament study context have a very different lexicon, mental lexicon for a word, than people working with, say, Liddell and Scott.
I will never work with the theological dictionaries. I always use Liddell and Scott because it's neutral and all yeah. But even then, you have always used several translations, several dictionaries. Then you know that where the problems are, and not where the solutions are.